All right, we'll get started here in just a few minutes. We're going to get some people logged in. My name is Greg Ondo. I'm going to be presenting from just outside Washington, D.C. area in Northern Virginia in the United States. And if you guys want to go ahead and feel free to introduce yourself and tell us where you're from. If you have comments that you want covered in the Hangout today, please feel free to enter them in on the comments field. And if you're watching this offline, you don't have to introduce yourself unless you want to in the comments field. But if we and for those watching offline, you may want to skip ahead 5 to 10 minutes. We usually kind of let people get logged in and get questions submitted, and then we get started from there. In the past, we've had people that have been generous enough to do kind of an index of topics that are covered in the Hangout. So if we have people that want to kind of keep notes of the different topics and questions as it's going on and can post that, that's super helpful for people that could jump to a specific question afterwards. So we'll go ahead and start letting people get logged in. We'll copy over some questions, and we'll get started in a few minutes. All right, so we have people from India, Dusseldorf, Germany. All right, so we had people requesting this in Spanish. Sorry, I only had a couple years of Spanish in high school. We have Dave from New Jersey. All right, we have Belgium checking in. All right, so we have Italy, Orlando. We have Robbie from Dallas. I'll be in Dallas in a couple weeks doing a clinic at Audio Dog. We have Tampa. All right, so we had a quick question. Do VST2 plugins work in 9.52? Yeah, so VST2 plugins work. I think they need to be 2.3 or 2.4. Generally, the 32-bit plugins, you would need to have a bridging solution. So VST2 plugins still work. All right, so we have Fort Lauderdale. We have Italy again. And once again, for those just logging in, if you want to introduce yourself and if you have questions that you want to ask, please feel free to enter them in the comments field. All right, we have Algeria. All right, we have Poland, Waterbury, Connecticut. So someone just asked if I have an email contact. You can reach out to me at clubcubase at steinberg.net. Right, so we have Netherlands, someone else from Poland. All right, we have Switzerland, London. I was in London this week, or last week on a layover. All right, we have Liz from Nashville. Good to see you online. We have Fort Washington, Quebec. All right, so we have just a quick question. When does the session start? We're going to get it started here in just a couple of minutes. We're just collecting questions, letting people get logged in. All right, so we have Buckeye, Arizona. We have Sweden. We have Cambridge, UK, New Jersey. All right, we have Riverside, California. All right, so we'll get we have a couple people. It seems like I'm hearing myself okay on my kind of test computer, but someone mentioned they couldn't hear. So I don't know if everyone could just confirm that you're hearing the audio. All right, so we have New York, Florida Keys. Been there many times. Beautiful. We'll get started here in just a couple minutes. Okay, so we'll see if there are any more questions coming in. Okay, so we got a question about scoring the picture. All right, so we have Stan from Poolsville. Good to see you online again. All right, we'll collect a couple more questions and get started. All right, so we have Serbia. See if there's any questions. If not, we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so our person that couldn't hear refreshed apparently and can hear now, so that's great. It's probably be boring to have a hangout where you couldn't hear anything. Okay, just copying over some questions. We'll get started here. Just a couple minutes. Thanks everyone for wonderful questions. All right, so we had a question about licensing. Says that you have an old copy of Cubase 5 that you want to take off of your e-licenser and give to your son. So really, within the e-licenser application, you could take the Cubase 5 license and then just simply transfer that license to the new e-licenser. All right, so a bunch of new questions coming in. So we had regarding the question about the license. If you updated your Cubase 5 license at a discount to 9.5, that is the same license that's been updated. So you probably couldn't just take off your Cubase 5 license. Okay, so copy or just got more questions and we'll get started. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. So we had a couple of questions sent in where a lot of people, one was dealing with an OMF file, but a question that comes up a lot is like, I want to take two mono files and render them into one single stereo file. So let's say if I have these two files, one is panned hard left and the other is panned hard right, and we wanted to create one stereo file between this. So one way is to just simply go to the export audio mixdown, and just choose a stereo out, and we could just say import to pool and to audio track, and we could very easily do that. One of the newer ways since version 8 with the render and place functionality I find very easy. So if I just wanted to come here, I could select the two files and go to my render settings, and at this point I could say I wanted to do the complete signal path, which could be like all of my inserts, EQs, sends, etc. But as we want to come here, I could just say mix down to one audio file, and I could choose to mute the source events if I wanted to. So at this point, I could just say render and turn those two mono files can now be muted as I select it. And then at that point, I could turn them into one stereo file. Now, if I select the two tracks, I could also get some additional options, I believe, when we go to the render settings. So this way I could actually say I wanted to remove the source tracks. So I could take my two mono tracks here if I wanted to, and then when I choose to render the files, I could just turn that directly into one stereo track like so. So those are some easy ways of just turning mono to stereo, two mono files into a stereo file. So if you're working with OMF files or transferring to some other DAW that's not quite as good with dealing with stereo files, that's a very easy way of working with that. Okay, so we'll go ahead, and we had some questions just kind of come up about dealing with, pitch bend range on different instruments and being able to draw in a lot of different instruments. So let's say if I added an instrument track here, let's just go for something synthy. I will now just kind of we'll add a track of retro log. I'll just mute this so it's not awful sounding. So let's say I just have just find a quick. Okay, so let's say if I just sequenced something in here, like one long note. Now, some people may want to get a little more creative. Let's say we have one note, and on top of that, let's say we go to our controller editor and people wanted to maybe draw in pitch bend data. So if I come here, I could kind of draw in different pitch bend data like so. Or if I wanted to be a little more streamlined, we can just kind of come here and we could select different tools. So if you wanted to come right there, so let's say I just want to do kind of a long pitch bend part, so we can just come here. Now, when one of the comments came up is how to set the pitch bend range, and that's really going to be determined by every single instrument. So I probably won't be able to find it just quickly, but on every single instrument, you can set the amount of pitch bend range. I think the question was specifically with Halion Sonic SE. So let's just open that up really quickly. And I'll just load up a quick patch. I'm just blanking where the pitch bend range is, but it's going to be basically set for every single instrument. Let me just see if I come here and do within the edit. So, but basically it's going to be as a part of every single instrument will have its own pitch bend range setting. I'm just kind of blanking where it is. But then you could do that. Now, some people want to take this pitch bend information and then turn it into kind of more flexible editing with curves. So if I wanted to come here, I could just go to my MIDI and then we could say extract MIDI automation. So, and then what you could do is we could choose to come here and you could select kind of different parameters. So if I even wanted to come here to my retro log, I could just say, let's go to retro log. And then if you wanted to go to channel 1, you could just also just draw in pitch bend using kind of the curve. So now if I wanted to just kind of enter in some automation, we could choose to have our pitch bend automation. So if I wanted to throw in a curve on my pitch bend, I could then even select this range and then just hit like Command D or Control D to duplicate. And you could just have that automatically carry over. So I'll just undo that. So if I just wanted to switch to my object selection tool and have different curve points, again, I could just have that as my pitch bend, select a range selection, and then just duplicate that range very easily. So that's kind of an easy way of dealing with different pitch bend data using kind of the new Bezier curves so that you can have things done and handled very quickly. So really great for kind of doing a lot of very, great electronic music or EDM functionality right there. We also had a question sent in about how to do step input. And the question was how to record MIDI information. They saw a YouTube video where someone was recording MIDI data, but they weren't doing it in real time. They're just using it in step input. So let's show you how you can set that up. I'll just start off with a new project. Let's add an instrument track. And we'll just do retro log here. So I'm going to create just a blank part to start with. And say we'll go 8 bars. And I'll double click. And you may have to, within the MIDI editor itself, to right click and show the step entry functions. So step MIDI input. So that may be turned off by default, but just right click and turn on the step MIDI input. I'll just go ahead and just kind of zoom my range here so you can see more octaves. And currently this will follow the snap or the quantize value here. So I'm going to activate my step input and we could see I'm going to start at bar 1 and we have, let's say, 5 bars. And I'm just going to hit one single note. And you'll see that once that this is turned on, there's my pitch that I hit. Now, if I wanted to change the rhythmic value, I could just come right here and I could say, okay, I want to now put in quarter notes. Or if I wanted to put in, half notes, and we could also just come right over here. And if we wanted to put in your different rhythmic values, you could do that. Now, if you wanted to actually put a rest in, so let's say like I have half notes there, but let's say I want to go back to eighth notes, I could hit the arrow key and that would automatically skip based on that value. I could also play chords. So let's say I want to put it in quarter note chords. Hit the right arrow key. And then you could just kind of keep entering in data like that. Now, if you found that you wanted to actually insert a particular note, what you can do is just come to a very specific region here. And then, at this point I could insert the pitch via step input. I could also input just the velocity. So if I just wanted to put in velocities but not pitch, like over a series of notes, I could do that. But we could also activate this mode here, which is the move insert. So if I'm right at this beat here, now when I go to input, let's say eighth notes, we'll notice that. If I set this up here, so let's say I want to go back to the beginning of my project. And we could just kind of come right here. So now that we have insert on, so we'll just come here. Now the insert is turned on. All the other events as we move kind of and we can navigate using our left and right arrows. So if I want to come here with insert turned on, everything can just be inserted in time while the events afterward get shifted. So if you're not like a traditionally great keyboard player, this is a great way of entering in a lot of different parts using step entry. And again, what you want to do is to right click and make sure that the step MIDI input is turned on, which it may not be by default. Come right over here, turn that on. You want to make sure it's kind of an orange color. And when it's an orange color, that's when it's engaged. And now you could and put in chords that way very easily. I know I've had some people argue to me that something that's step sequenced sounds different rhythmically to them than something that's quantized afterwards. So I've heard that argument from some people. Will swear up and down that step sequencing will give it a different feel, even if it's mathematically similar. But you could spend time and discover if that works for you. But if you're doing like a bunch of like type of sequences and you don't want to slow down the whole project, if your keyboard skills aren't there, step sequencing is a great way of being able to enter in that MIDI data. So. All right, so let's go through some of our questions. All right, so we had a question about running different MIDI tracks at different tempos. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we could do this. So what they wanted is to have one groove agent at 120 beats and another groove agent at 104 beats a minute, and have both of those parts. So we'll come here. I'll just add a quick groove agent SE. And let's load up a quick kit here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just create a blank part here. We'll go to our drum editor, and let's just say right now our tempo is set to 120 beats. So the goal is they wanted to have one MIDI part at a different tempo and kind of not respond to different tempo changes. So let's say I will go ahead and we'll just paint in some kick drums here. Okay, so let's say if we play this back with the click, So we get the idea. Okay, now when we deal with Cubase, tracks can be in musical mode or linear mode. And tracks that are in musical mode will kind of base their timing of the bar and beat based on the tempo, whereas the linear mode will be based on the actual time position. So if I duplicated this track, so let's say we have now two different kicks, and what I want to do is to take the first one, and I'm going to put this into linear mode. And we can see this little icon here and we can do it on the track or on the actual. So I'm just going to take my MIDI track and put that into linear mode where we see a little clock. So the quarter note indicates, or if you're in England, I guess it's a crotchet, indicates that it is going to be musical mode. We can see if we go down to 94 beats a minute, that this track will play back directly in time based on the new tempo. Whereas this track, the top track, that's in linear mode, will play back at the same exact positions. So this way you could actually kind of take these two different tempos of different tracks, so you could, have that work for you. Now, this also can come in handy, and we could discuss this a little bit, like if we had a project that was set to like a film scoring project, which is one of our questions we had. Let me just see if I have a video file. See if this video works. Let's see if I have another video file. Okay, so I'll just import this video file. All right, and let me just set up my frame rate. All right, so if we have just our video file here, what you could do is sometimes if you wanted a MIDI event to occur at a very specific point in time, this is where MIDI, so let's say if we're watching this video and right where he puts the cigarette in his mouth, we wanted a MIDI event to occur. So what we could do at this point is just take that. We have like our time position here. And if it's in linear mode, what you could do is actually just move the event itself directly to where he puts the cigarette in his mouth. So at that point, you could move that MIDI note to start right at the cursor. So if you wanted to, I believe you could actually just say move to cursor. So that event will start at that time. Now, if I had different tempo changes, being that if I adjust the tempo, we notice that kick drum will always occur because it's in linear mode will always occur directly where the cigarette is. Whereas these tracks are going to be set up in musical mode, and their position will change based on the tempo. So as you adjust the tempo, if it's in musical mode, it will not necessarily line up to the picture cue. So if you had like, a very specific, and one of the things that a lot of people don't know in working with the video is you could actually just kind of put your cursor here in the video and you could go like, 2 seconds to advance. So you could just simply move and navigate within the video window itself. So as we work on this, linear tracks can be locked to the actual picture, whereas musical tracks are going to be locked to the tempo. So if you have an event that's going to occur directly, that's going to be correlated exactly to the picture, like a visual cue, you'd probably want to use linear mode for that particular event. Or you could, if you wanted to adjust with the tempo, that's when you'd want it to be like this track in musical mode. So between those two, you may have different musical elements that are going to line up directly, with a visual element. And one of the other things that you could do and when working with this is you could go to bars and beats, but if you switch, like let's say if between here where this scene changes, that you wanted to actually move the bar there, we could actually grab what we call the time warp tool. So I can say measure 7 starts right at that position. And we can say right until the picture changes. Let's say right where that guy comes in, where it switches cameras. I wanted that to be measures. I could now just kind of move the different measures to different points of the video. And as it does this, it creates a tempo map for you. So you could kind of map the grid and you can say between here and here, I want 8 bars of data. And then you could just align the musical grid to different markers if you wanted to, or different points, and say, I need measure 22 to be right here. And then we could have an even tempo between, and that will automatically do the tempo mapping for you. So there's a lot of great things, but think of linear mode as being kind of tied to a visual element within the picture, and musical mode will actually be set up to speed up and slow down independent of the picture itself. And then using the time warp to recalculate bars so that it fits in musically with the visual cues. All right, so we had a question, what effect could we use to do like a rotary speaker effect? On a vocal. So let me just kind of come here, find something with a vocal. Okay, so let's say if we have, so I'll just go ahead for my inserts. I think there's a rotary plugin. Let's just go ahead and take a look. It's probably under modulation. So we'll go ahead and just kind of solo. So this is without the effect. So let's say we'll just do a little bit of. So kind of an underwater sound, which is kind of asked. So we'll try a Halloween organ. Let's jump back here. So if you're looking for, you know, different underwater type sounds, this is a good place to start. Again, kind of bypass. Turn it on and off. So that's a great plugin to kind of get that type of sound if you're looking for kind of very creative, maybe sound design, underwater sound, or kind of evocative atmosphere for working with vocals to get kind of a different flavor. All right, so we had a question on reversing audio. And again, just a quick reiteration. Someone had a question on this, you know, asking about how to do curves for automation. So we'll just kind of reiterate this, just a comment. You know, so if you have a line here, or, you know, there's different tools within the line tool that you can use for kind of, you know, drawing in different curves like that. Or if you want to do square waves, you know, you can just kind of come in here and draw in square waves if you wanted to. But a lot of people really liked within 9.5 kind of the ability of doing your Bezier curves just like that. So anytime that you have 2 points, and you could also just simply adjust a curve and go to the center point and adjust a curve just that easily. All right, so we had a question about just reversing the audio. So let me just start a new project here and how to do it in the newer versions. All right, didn't like that. Sorry about that. All right. Okay, so I'll just do a new empty project here. Okay, let me just find a little more interesting sound. So let's say I have this sound and I just wanted to reverse the audio. All you'd have to do is just select it. And then if you go to processes, and then you could just reverse just like that. So seems pretty straightforward. I'll just reread the question, make sure I'm not misunderstanding it. Okay, so yeah, so it just seems like really all you have to do to just reverse, and you could also just go to the audio menu to processes. And then at this point, you could just choose to, reverse that again. So let's say if I had a particular drum loop here, just so we could hear it. So if I play, and let me just check my audio connections here one more time. Sorry about that. So if I just, select that file and processes and reverse, that now when we play it back. So that's kind of really all you have to do. You could also kind of achieve the same thing by going into, I think the question indicated that artist, but in 9.5, you could also just go into the direct offline processes here and just reverse that and be able to delete that one just as easily. So that's seems pretty straightforward. But if you have more questions, just let me know in the comments. We had some questions on how to utilize the built-in DSP effects of the, I think question we had mailed in was on a UR44, but also we had kind of a similar question on the UR242. So the Steinberg branded hardware has some onboard DSP so that we could actually monitor or print with different effects on inputs. So this will depend. So when you have the audio, when you have it kind of set up, you could actually, at this point, would say once you have the VST audio system assigned to, let's say, the UR44, and we go to our audio connection. So let's say we have an input channel. So let's say I wanted to add like 2 mono inputs. And let's add just another mono. We'll add 4 mono inputs and a stereo input here. So I have 6 inputs on my device. And let's say for my outputs, I'll just choose to, for my control room, we'll set this up. And what I want to do now is we'll just have this configured like so. So now if I wanted to record, let's say I had 6 channels. I could choose my various inputs here accordingly. And this is where it will make sense probably to go into the full screen mix console. So once you have this set up, you have what's called the audio hardware setup tab. And here you could adjust kind of reverb routing and also different settings like for inputs 5 and 6, if you wanted a +4, -10, if you wanted to have a high pass filter, if you wanted to set up the loop back functionality. So these are specifically to the UR interfaces that have the DSP capabilities. So the URT2, or URT4 and higher, the UR242 and higher. So once we get there, we could now go into our full mix console view. And in the input channels, we have functionality for hardware. All right, so within this, we could come over here and we could choose for our different mic breeze. We could choose to have a high pass filter or phase polarity reversal. So you could, flip the phase on input if needed. But you have this little drop down menu here. So once this is turned on, there's two different positions. One is that there's no effect. Two, that you have effects that are monitored only. And three, that you have effects that are applied during the recording process. So these effects, such as the morphing channel strip, will allow you to have compression and EQ, or we could choose to have different guitar amps. So you're going to have a clean guitar amp, a crunch guitar amp, a lead amplifier, as well as drive. So you can play these, and they're basically powered directly from the onboard EQ, or from the onboard DSP rather. So we could monitor this. So once it's in the middle position, this monitors the input channel or can print the input channel. So you have your choice of being able to have no effect. If you wanted to compress on the way in without having to have a hardware compressor, you could do that. Or you could just simply come right over here and print the effects. So you can monitor, no effect. The middle position is monitoring the effect or printing the effect. And we could also have your built-in RevX reverb. So this isn't just like a generic reverb. This is a very high quality reverb. And here you could set the amount of that reverb, and we can monitor with the reverb, but not print the reverb. So at this point, we could choose to just have that RevX reverb, and you could have varying amounts on your different inputs. So if you want to have less on guitar and more on the voice, you could set various levels just like that from your inputs. So once you have those set up, and once you have those inputs defined in your studio connections, in your audio connections, and they're routed to inputs on the UR44, the UR242, or even the upcoming URT-T4, you'll see the hardware tab become visible in the racks in the mixer. And from here, all you do is you have your invert the phase. You could have your high pass filter, your channel strip that could be bypassed, monitored with 5 different effects, so 4 guitar amps and the morphing channel strip, or applied to the file and monitored with reverb. Now, once you have these units, they also come with native versions of the plugin. So if you're like, wow, that reverb sounded amazing, you could just come directly over here and have the RevX reverb as a normal plugin. But this could impose some additional latency because it's being used from your computer's processor. So, but the units on the input stage, and again, you could see this input stage directly on the full mixer view within the racks here. So within the hardware settings, you could have these without any imperceptible latency. So again, you can have the morphing channel strip, and we could choose to edit that. So compressor and EQ. And what's kind of cool is you could actually kind of morph between different optimized values just by rotating the encoder here. So as you adjust that, or monitor with the effects, and again, without taking any of your CPU resources. So if your singer wants to hear reverb, and adding a software reverb really kind of, compounds the latency, and kind of affects their actual performance, this is a great way of being able to accomplish that using the onboard DSP of the UR audio interfaces. So I hope that makes sense. So we have a question, why not implementing the classic drum machines instrument from Cubasis into Cubase Pro? I believe that all of the content for the Cubasis, including the classic machines, do come from the included content of Cubase. I could be mistaken, but I think if you go through, you could actually, and they might be inside not of Groove Agent, but maybe some of the kits within the Halion Sonic SE. But I believe that all the additional Cubasis sounds are derived from Cubase. I'm about 99% sure of that, but I don't know for sure. But I think if you go through the different presets for the the Cubasis content, and I think that I haven't tried this with the particular classic the classic machines, but I think that if you actually export your project, you may see which sounds are there. That might be one way of doing it, but I haven't tried that with my Cubasis projects yet. I usually just kind of do straight audio, but you could try to import the project from Cubasis and see what instruments it does open. But I believe that those sounds are derived from content that exists in Cubase. Okay, so we had a question about slicing audio, like some multi-track drums, and changing the length. So let's see if we could do that here quickly. Okay, so one of the things that a lot of people miss, like if you wanted to, do quantizing of drums. So let's say maybe you had a project like this and you wanted to tighten up drums to make them a little more on the grid. So there's some easy ways of kind of doing the slices. So like if you wanted to quantize drums, and let's say like maybe like drum fills, we can see how maybe the drum fill is a little late than the beat. So if we actually just kind of double click, we could go to our hit points function, and we could do this kind of for our main drum parts here. So let's say I want to adjust the threshold of my kick to include the kick but not the other elements. And let's say I go to my snare and double click, and I wanted to adjust the threshold of my snare so that it's only represents where the snare hits but not the hi-hat or kick. And let's say in this case, let's go to my hi-hat, and we'll zoom in and kind of do the same. All right, so what I want to do now is to assign all of these and put them into a folder track. So if they're not in a folder track already, you could just hold down Shift and select all the events and choose to move selected tracks to new folder. But I have these in the folder, and the folder track will give you something called group editing. So now if I wanted to come here, I could just do editing kind of in all of the parts as a single part here. So it kind of is a single entity. So if I go to, let's say, my quantize values, I could select kind of different tracks that represent kind of my priorities. So say I want the kick to have the highest priority, the snare, and then followed by the hi-hat. And this will kind of set conditions based on these different elements here. So at this point, like if we're going to do kind of a traditional multi-track drum quantizing, I could slice based on that material, based on those kind of conditions. So where kick, snare, and hi-hat have the highest priority. At this point, we could choose that we wanted to set our grid to eighth notes. And as we do this, we could just say quantize. But if a note, depending on the placement of the note, you may actually see that it will place gaps in the audio files themselves. And at that point, we could choose to just do a crossfade between those gaps. So if we wanted to now, if I did everything correctly, you can just kind of, you know, have that all set. Now the question was, let's say if I wanted to undo, once we do this, if we could set the length to 50 milliseconds for all the events. So let me just reread it and make sure. So I think if we maybe go to, so let's say if you want it to be just the transients, and let's say if we go to our processes, let's see, it's got a lot of different events here. So we have like thousands of different events. Excuse me for hitting my mic. All right, this may be too many events for it. Let me just see if I can exit out of Cubase here real quick. Sometimes. I'll try just quick force quit on that. But I think if you would then, I'll give this a quick try again, that if you set, it to time stretching, or you could actually, there's another approach we could take for this. So at this point, let's say we go to the same project and we'll just do our slices here quickly. So again, I'll go to my hit points. And now let's just adjust our threshold here. So let's say we've now sliced. So one other thing that you could probably do is, let's say these are all selected. So let's say select all the events. And just kind of grab the tail end. I'll just turn off my snap here. So that could be one way of adjusting it as well, or just doing kind of a massive amount of time stretching. But that's how I would approach it if you wanted to adjust it more than, to like a fixed amount. So I'll see if this misbehaves here. So let's say if I go to my direct offline processes, and let's say I just do a time stretch. I may have to do this for. So I would try to just kind of drag it. This might be too, depending on your source material, it might be too far. I'll just force quit. Just take a while to accomplish that. But I would try just to manually adjust the time. And you could probably also just set the time for all of the events in the info line to like 50 milliseconds. So, but let me know if think that would work for you, if that makes sense, and then we could maybe explore it a little bit further. I could try with maybe a project that's doesn't have like 18 million audio files that I've sliced up. Okay, so we had a question on nudging a MIDI note in the key editor by millisecond. Okay, moving a note here in the editor we can nudge by various amounts. So if we come here, we could just say, open up your nudge palette. And, one of the cool things a lot of people don't realize when you have your nudge palette open, that you could nudge different components here based on your actual time value. So if we have it set to seconds, I could say I wanted to nudge this event over by like 1 millisecond. So if you actually kind of watch the start time here, we can see that this will increment as I nudge left or right. So the question was how to do this within the key editor. So let's make sure we have the nudge palette turned on. And I'm going to switch my main timeline to seconds. And now I'll select this. We see our start position here. And as I nudge, let's see if we can. Let's try this note here. Looks like that will still kind of nudge it. Based not on the grid, but what you could do, it looks like it doesn't work with the nudge palette as I would expect it to, but you could just come here to the end position and just be able to nudge using the mouse scroll wheel. But I'll pass that on because I think that it would work. Let me just set my master timeline here to seconds. Yeah, it looks like it's still basing it off of bar and beat. I'll make a note of that and pass it on. But if you just have this, your timeline here set to seconds, you could, even though it doesn't work with the nudge, you can still kind of accomplish the same thing using the capabilities here of just using the scroll wheel up and down to nudge it by 1 millisecond. So I would think that the nudge would kind of work the same way it does in the project window, but I'll pass that on. Okay, so just a question about in FL Studio, a chop function. So I'm not familiar with that function. You can make interesting melodies with 2 or 3 clicks of your mouse. So let's just say if I wanted to, let me just kind of go to a project here. I think I have some. So let me just make sure we have this set up. All right. So if we're listening to something here, let's say if I had just one, there's all sorts of ways to do kind of different, in to make like a MIDI part more interesting. I'm not that familiar with like a particular chop function in FL Studio, but if I wanted to take like a simple MIDI part and kind of, change it, one of the things I could do is just to add like a chord track. So if I come here, let's just add, a chord track, and I could tell this particular part here to follow the chord track. So now if I just kind of play this back, let's say we wanted to listen to this first phrase. I could just enter in, my chord track and just say, okay, I want this to be in D major. And you could actually have it and let's say if I wanted to change that chord to like an F chord, or let's say I want to do an F minor ninth over a D chord. And you could just have it automatically do different variations like so. But you could also, within the editor itself, apply different transpositions for scales. So if I say, okay, I just want to take this here, and if you go to your MIDI editor, you could also do some really interesting transpose setup. So you could say, okay, I want it not to, to say, okay, I want it to be in the Phrygian mode of F, and then have that automatically change the scale. But, having the part automatically follow the chord track. And there's also different expression, different MIDI inserts that you could apply. So if you wanted to come in here and, adjust even like different MIDI echoes. So at this point, you can just say, I want to take that And let's open up like a MIDI echo so you could, so you could do interesting stuff. Plus, obviously different arpeggiators. You could trigger different, uh, beat designers. You could do micro tuning. So if you say, okay, I just want to take this and do, pure major, pure minor, Pythagoras. So, different options. But I would, if you have like a really simple melody that you wanted to change, I would check out some of the different MIDI functionality for the transpose setup. Check out, the arpeggiator, but also just add a chord track and have that particular MIDI track follow the chords. And then, if I wanted to just take that one particular lick here and do different chords, let's say I just duplicated this event, and then every bar put in a different chord. So let's say I want to do F. Say I will do D diminished. Come here as a G sharp. Let's make it an E suspended 4. So now this part. So you could come up with interesting parts using kind of the chord track very easily to get different variations in addition to like typical arpeggiators. Okay, just reading through a couple comments, so just bear with me just a second. All right, so we had a question on what is the auto select function in a key editor. So let me just quickly, we'll say I will revert this to save. Okay, so let's say in the key editor I had like modulation information. Okay, and let's say maybe I had expression. All right, so let's say I had all of these different edit windows open simultaneously. So let's say I have velocity, I have expression, and now I wanted to see my modulation. So there's a little edit window that a lot of people miss, and make sure where it's called auto select controllers. And it's this icon here. So a lot of times if I moved MIDI notes around, let's say I took this range of MIDI notes and moved it, the controllers that were associated with those notes didn't move. So if I undo that, we can see the notes move, but none of the controllers themselves move. We see the velocity move because that's tied to the note. But if I come here, let's say I have this turned on, the auto select controllers, as I move an event, the controllers themselves can get moved as well. So at this point, I could have the events and the controllers move simultaneously, just like that. So that's what the auto select controllers function does right there. So without that on, I could just select the event. The controllers don't move. As soon as I have the event selected here, I could now have the controllers and the notes move simultaneously. So if you had your pitch bend or modulation, that would automatically move together with the notes as they're moved. And if you don't see that functionality, just right click and make sure that the auto select controllers function is enabled. And someone else had a good point in the comments. I'll share with people that are watching afterwards. You know, if you wanted to come here, let's say I just wanted to go maybe like to this voice here. And one of the cool things is, you know, being able to record. And, you know, there's some other things that you could do as well. So let's say if you wanted to go to your MIDI modifiers, you could also just kind of randomize pitch. If you wanted to, so let's say you wanted to randomize pitch, let's say 7 semitones, either way up. So you could kind of process those things. But something else that's kind of cool is, you know, being able to take your arpeggiator here and, you know, being able to, so let's just say, you know, being able to also write in that data. So if we go to, let's say, our MIDI inserts and have this set up for your arpeggiator, I could just hold down a chord, and as I hit record here, so that's something else. And you could kind of change the order and the key range of the notes and step, you know, if you wanted to have it just be random as well. So let's set it to something. And then to be able to record all of those changes as you kind of, as if you played them, is really helpful. All right, so we had a question related to the chord tracks, is when kind of drawing in chords that they find a selection limiting. I think you can pretty much do almost every single chord. There may be some different schools of thought on the naming conventions, but you know, if you wanted to come here and enter a chord, again, it's not going to be just like, you know, C major. So you have, if you want to do like C major, minor, diminished, augmented, suspended second, suspended fourth, plus your different tensions and, you know, your different root notes here, and, you know, or different inversions. You could also just do like a MIDI input. So if you come here, you could just kind of play a chord. I'll just play something really random, and then it will automatically, let's say if I just put my hand down. So, you know, I think it can handle just about any, whatever the theory is on just about any chord progression, but it might be kind of, you know, like a, you know, different terminologies, different naming conventions. But let's say I just randomly put my wrist across my MIDI controller, you know, so it could determine different chords like that. So I think just about all the complex chords that you could imagine. I've seen lots of, you know, great jazz artists who didn't have any problems finding all the voicings for their chords. So it could be under different, you know, voicings to work with. So, but I think it'll cover just about any chord scenario you could imagine. All right, so we had a question on in the MediaBay how to preview different samples. So let's say if I have, my different sounds here, I could just preview here. All right, so to set that up, what you need to have is it's going to be set up within your audio connections, and the customer who mentioned this said that they had Cubase Pro 9.5. So you want to use the control room. So first you want to make sure that the control room is turned on. You probably want to have your output here set to not connected. It's a little seems a little counterintuitive at first, but what you want to do is then to right click and you can add a monitor. I have all 4 monitors set up, and set the audio output here where you're going out to your monitors. And this allows you to have 4 different monitors set up. So now as soon as it's activated in the control room, and this is done in the VST connections in previous versions to 9.5, but once that is set up there, and that creates kind of like the listen bus, you can now click here and audition all of your and preview your different sounds in the control room. All right, so we had a question about taking like a audio part with and using the chord track to kind of change them. So let's say if I want to take like bass, I think we could use our previous example here. So let me just jump back to that project we were on before. So let's say if I've come here, and my Cubase is not happy today. Sorry about that. Doesn't like that one project. It's acting up. So I'll try a different project. Sorry about that. I'm not sure if I have the construction sets on my. So just try another one where we do our bass. Okay, so let's see if we could do this, and we'll have the bass follow the chord track. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and select a range here. We have a number of different edits. I'm just going to select those and just for simplicity's sake, we'll bounce the selection. And we'll choose to replace the events. And what I want to do now is to just come here, and I'm just going to do like a pitch and warp. And I'll mute the guitars.
I know you're looking good.
Okay, so let me just... All right, so I want to tell the bass to follow the chord track. Okay, let me just add a chord track here above the bass. So we'll start on E. All right, let's see, the bass follows this now. So there we can hear the bass kind of go directly to the key of D. Let me just go to my mix console here and kill the guitars. And I'll just kill my guitar automation here. So as we work with this, we'll hear the bass coming. So let's say I want to make this D, and then we'll have it modulate up to, let's say, E. And B, followed by G. So we'll just come right here. So let's say not all the chords there had parts. So let's say here I wanted to go to back to D from G. So every time we could just kind of come right here. Let's say we wanted to go up chromatically on every single one. So now we want to go rise chromatically, pitch. Then we'll go up to E. So you hear how well just, doing that very easily with chord track, you can change the bass line for a part. Okay, just reading through some comments here. Thanks for all the great questions. All right, so we had a question about the MediaBay, like for the right zone browser, if that could be put onto a different screen. So what you can do is just simply, if you go to, your MediaBay here. So your MediaBay, this is really kind of a subset of the features of MediaBay, and this could be placed anywhere. And you could also have, if you wanted to go to like your sound browser here, you could have this be, very narrow with your attributes if you wanted to. And this could be placed freely on any screen that you have as a floating window. Something that some people don't know is that you could expand the size of MediaBay on the right-hand side as well. A lot of people, I think, when it first came out in 8.5, found that this was a little too large for their liking, depending upon their screen resolution. But if you could scale that size, but if you want the MediaBay to be kind of, available on another screen, you could kind of reconfigure, the loop browser or, all these different windows for different widths, and these could be placed anywhere that you wanted them to be located at as well. So we have a question, someone's doing the mixing Cubase right now. How can they raise or lower the volume without going into the mix console? If you could come directly here onto the channels themselves with, if you, let's say you don't have the lower zone active, you could just select the channel here and be able to do your mixing without having the mix console open. A lot of people will also use clip gain to just adjust the volume louder or softer. You could also, if you don't want to use, if you didn't want to use the faders, you also have the ability of just drawing in volume directly on your console, and this will be kind of pre-fader gain, so you could use that to your advantage, but be aware it may affect gain structure in certain scenarios. So there's a number of ways to, if you're in the middle of a mix and you don't want to open up your mix console, to actually, just come here and adjust volume beforehand. So a lot of people, like the clip gain, if it's kind of more of a macro functionality, and may just, click here in the lower left-hand corner to draw in different velocity curves as well. Something that was introduced in 9.5 is the ability within the automation just to select a range and increase the entire range of automation. So if you want something to be a little louder or softer, you can do it quite easily that way. So seeing a question, you know, in Cubase 7 that the person had contact in Omnisphere, but in 9.5 they're not finding him. One is to make sure that you have the 64-bit versions of those plugins installed. So that could be really critical, just making sure that, again, you have your 64-bit version installed. With version 9, they stopped bridging the 32-bit plugins. You could still you know, run 32-bit plugins with third-party bridging solutions. But if you actually want it, you know, to make sure that they're going to function correctly, and both of those programs have 64-bit versions, make sure you have those installed. Okay, just reading through a couple questions here. Thanks for all the wonderful questions from everyone. Okay, so we had a question on tempo track. So let's just do a new project. Okay, so let's say we have different tempo tracks. I'm just going to read different changes in our tempo here. So let's say we're at 120, down to 80, and say 103 and 109. So I think the question is getting maybe a pre-roll click before the tempo change. So if we're here, maybe to get, I'm not sure if it's while it's playing, but what you could do, I think if we go to under transport, metronome setup, so I think, you know, you could do like the time signature, or, you know, kind of often like the tempo during, you know, let me see if there's an option for that. So I just want to make sure, maybe if you could clarify that, to see if, like, at this point, if you, before, like, while it's playing, that it would give you a transition tempo to from like 120 to 80, or if it's just like where we hit record here. Let's say if we have our pre-roll turned on. And we'll set this for 1 bar. So I think it's gonna, you know, kind of follow the tempo, but let's say if we're right here, Okay, so let me just set that for. So it will, and I'm not sure if I'm, just to make sure I'm understanding, if you wanted it to gradually change or if you wanted it to change, you could kind of set a pre-roll and then you could have the previous tempo as a pre-roll before it does recording. But maybe if you could reiterate the question in the comments field, that'd be helpful. Okay, so it's just a question, is exporting a VST instrument into 96 kilohertz audio file the same quality when the record mode is set to 44.1 in the session? Or is the audio being converted from 44 kilohertz? It's what's more critical when doing kind of conversions. Sometimes the sample rate can be helpful, because whatever is exported through the audio engine, the VST instrument will be playing at kind of a higher quality if you set it to 96K versus 44.1. Where it gets to be really critical is, doing like 16 to 24 bit, bit changes, or 24 to 32 bit. But since the original source of the audio, or of the instrument was never set at 44.1, exporting it at a higher sample rate will improve the quality of that, but it may not improve the quality of the audio files as much. So. All right, so we had a question about setting up kind of a reference track that's not going through the mixer. And we did a tutorial video on this, but we'll go ahead and show it again. So let's say if let's say if you wanted to have a reference track for your mix down. So let's say I'll just go ahead and do a quick, I'm going to create kind of a reference file here. So I'll just export really quickly. And we'll show you a way that you could kind of have a reference mix that's not really set up directly, that's not going through like, master fader functions. All right, let me just do that one more time and make sure I had my settings correct. Oh, I'm just going to activate this file. Sorry about that. It's a bummer when it's your own fault for operator error. So I'm going to do a quick audio mix down on this file. So let's say I have this as a So, one of the, notoriously tricky things is when using a DAW is having a reference mix that's not going through like the same channel configuration. So let's say I have a reference mix here. In this case, it's going to be the same song, but I'll just. And so if I played it back, same time. So let's say this is my reference mix that's already been mastered and run through a number of different processes, and I want to compare my unmastered mix to it. So running a reference, that's if you're doing additional processes. Could be unfair because if you have on the master fader processes, that could be very tricky to actually get an accurate comparison to. So let's say if I'm here and we also had a question, when to use a limiter. So, under dynamics, we'll show you some, the limiting functionality that you have. So let's say we just want to go to like a brick wall limiter. And this is often just to kind of make like the master sound a little bigger and fuller. So. So let's say I have this going through like an EQ. So this is what my mix is, and I wanted to compare a reference track, which I've imported here into my timeline. So now if I played this back, it would go through, and it would basically go through not only my master output chain, but the EQ. So if I set this to no bus, and what I'm going to do is go into my control room, and we're going to make sure that we have one of our, we'll put it into our drum mix here. So what I'm going to do is assign our reference track here, and we'll just call this reference. And then what I want to do is to go to my cues, and we're going to send it to Q1 at 0 dB. So right now I could listen. So this is not being sent out to our master bus. So it's being sent nowhere other than our cue mix. And in the control room, I could say this is what our mix of our project sounds like. And now I could switch to Q1. So let's say I'll just make this. I'll do like a real extreme EQ here. So now at this point, I'm only hearing. So when I go to Q1, what it's doing is only playing back. We're only hearing this, but when I go to my mix, that could be my mix going through all the channel settings here. So this is to be my mix compared to the reference track. So that's all the EQ and the limiting applied to it. So I can say, here's our reference track that's been mastered and my track. This way you could compare them very easily, just allowing you to toggle back and forth between a reference track that's not going through the master fader and master processing. And that way it's just, literally one mouse click and you could have a mastered reference track compared to your mix in a very, reliable, effective manner. Yeah, so we had a question, can you assign tracks to, multiple outputs? So each track can have, different destinations. So if I wanted to come here, I could see we have 11 sources that are feeding this particular stereo out, but I could then send this track to no bus, to stereo out, left, right, to a side chain input. So you can route these to anywhere that you want. You could also, if you wanted to kind of create a mult, just simply come here. You could duplicate the track. You could use a send to send it out to other destinations or groups as well. So if you wanted to do kind of a mult, you could do that through a send or duplicate the tracks. So if you need to send it to more than 8 destinations, you could send it to multiple group tracks. So there's 9 different destinations you could send a particular track to quite easily, in addition to or simultaneously. And you could also, if you have Cubase Pro 9, you also have direct outs. So if you wanted to come here, you could right click or go to your racks configuration here. And let's say you have direct routing, and now you could take your direct routing and you could send that to multiple destinations, but make sure that you have the direct routing summing mode enabled directly here. So you could send it to one main output. You could send it out to 8 sends, and let's see, I think you have, see how many outputs it'll give us here for our direct. I think it's, see if it's 4 or 8. So you could have 5 direct out routing outputs as well, it looks like. So so it allows you to send to multiple destinations quickly. So we had a question on VST connections in 9.5. This is relabeled as audio connections. So these will be your available inputs. You could have kind of the program can find different input connections, but it will default to a stereo in, stereo out. And depending on if you have more inputs and outputs in your audio interface, you could right click and just choose to add a bus. And once you add a bus, you could just simply come here and tell which exact configuration. If you click here on add bus, you could say I wanted to add, a number, say, 5 mono inputs. And then you could assign these as you see, as you need or as you want them configured directly from your input channels or from the inputs of your audio interface. The outputs can be set up the same way. So if you wanted to add bus, you could have different surround configurations. If you want to do like, left, right, center, or left, center, right, quadraphonic, 5.1. So, and again, you could have these go to multiple, destinations and configurations. So if you wanted to add 3 stereo outputs or mono outputs, you could have that set up as well. So inputs and outputs, we could think of how these are actually, using the available inputs and outputs of your audio interface. You can have up to, different effects channels. So if you know that you always want it to have a particular reverb, let's say like, I got the UR44, I love that RevX reverb, I want that by default. Or I wanted to add different groups, so I wanted to have and you could name directly here as well. So you can say I want a guitar group, I wanted to add another group that's available, so let's say drums, and let's say vocals, so now you could add these groups and have them available. It's the same thing as if you right click and choose to add a group channel directly there. So you can see that you could add a group channel to vocals if you wanted to. External effects, this would allow you to have, let's say if you have a favorite compressor or a favorite reverb unit, you could connect these directly into your audio interface using available connections, analog or digital. And then if you needed to access those particular plugins, you could just go to inserts and you'd see them under external effects. And you have a ping function there that would actually offset the latency of the audio signal path for you. So you could use kind of your favorite outboard gear the same way as using your software plugins, but again, just using inputs and outputs of your audio interface. External instruments, like let's say we have like a Yamaha montage. I could add an external instrument. So I'll come directly here. We'll add a montage. And what I need to do here is to tell what connections it's connected to. So let's say, okay, I want to have inputs 5 and 6. So this is, if you work this way, this, helps if you have a lot of inputs and outputs in your system. So now when I go to add a virtual instrument, at this point, when I go to my VSTI, I could say let's add a track instrument, and now I could go out to my external instrument and I could just have it go directly out to my montage, and I could take the output from my montage and connect it to the input of my audio interface, and then I don't have to worry about a mixer. Now the control room could be like very powerful once you have it set up. This would allow you to have a talkback microphone. You could have up to 4 different cue mixes or headphone mixes for different artists. So in this case, I have a headphone mix set up for drums, bass, piano, or like drums, bass, piano, saxophone, or guitars, vocals, whatever configuration makes sense. Connect these to outputs that would feed outputs that are fed into your that are fed directly from outputs of your audio interface directly to the headphone amp of your audio interface if you have that configured, or feed it into audio outputs that are connected to a headphone amp. You could also have up to 4 monitors, and when you right click you would see these different options. So if you wanted to have like a Yamaha HS7, a JBL, an Eve, or a Yamaha NS10, you'd be able to, from the control room, just simply switch between your different monitors directly here. So that way you don't need a hardware monitor switch box. You could also have a talkback microphone so that if you wanted to communicate with people who are recording in the studio, you could activate the talkback mic directly here, and then you could communicate directly with each of the individual musicians that you wanted to, or not communicate with them. So that way you have a talkback mic, and that's using an available input on your audio interface. So going back to our control room setup, you could also have external inputs. So let's say if you wanted to have like an iPad connected, or a CD player or a 2-track tape machine, we could have those connected to inputs. So say we have a 1/2-inch master deck. Then within the control room, we could go to your external inputs. So once that is connected, we can now just come directly here and say, okay, we're in the control room. We could now, choose different monitors, different down mix presets, different headphone cue mixes. So all these things can be set up very easily. So just a quick recap. So these are your audio inputs, your outputs. Now, so the inputs and outputs we could think of on your audio interface could be configured very flexibly. We could add group and different effects channels directly here. External effects for external effects processing, again, using available inputs and outputs, just like our instruments. So if we have a lot of external MIDI gear, we could just have those kind of in line, and we do a mix down. It's automatically going to be configured directly for mixdown as well, but it would do it in real time because it has to send the MIDI out and then be able to capture it back through the connection. And then we have the control room with talkback, external inputs, as well as capability for monitoring switches and your QMIC and different speakers, all configured directly from your audio connections or VST connections menu. So a lot of flexibility there, and you can really configure it for a lot of different needs very quickly. All right, so we had a question if we had a project dealing with some tempo mapping. So let's see, I think I may have a project that's set up. Okay, so one of the great things that Cubase does is tempo mapping. Let me see, you may not have. Let's see if I have the files here. Okay, so let's say we had a couple questions on tempo mapping, and like how to take a project that had a fluctuating tempo and make it all regular and consistent. So let's say if I turn on my metronome, that there's no real correlation between the metronome and what's going on. So I'm going to take an overhead track here, go to my project menu, and let's do tempo detection. So it's going to do an analysis. I can do this for MIDI or audio sources. So now when I play back, so I just chose the overhead drums. You could often use kick or snare, depending on the material. And when it did this, is it automatically figured out that it kind of breaks it down into being 1/4. So what I would need to do is to find kind of the downbeat of what's going on. All right, so what I want to do is to now just, so I think kind of right here is where our downbeat is. So I'm going to put in 4/4 and we'll just, oh, it was off by a beat, I think. So let me just listen to it again. Okay, so let's say, so I'm just going to find where my 4/4 is. All right, so I'm going to move my tempo, my signature and tempo track up to the top. So basically what it's done is it's figured out what is going on rhythmically, what tempo is going on. So it's pretty amazing in of itself that it could do that. So we listen to it. But if we wanted to straighten up the tempo, what we could do is to now select all of the files in our project. And what I'm going to do is go to audio to advanced, and we'll say set definition from tempo. And I could store it within the audio files themselves or within the project only. And what that's going to do is basically embed the tempo changes of every single beat into every single audio file. So once that's done, I can now, so we see it fluctuating around maybe 140 beats a minute. I could now just say be perfectly 140 beats a minute. So now when I hit play, I can see kind of the original tempo. Or if I want it to be 150, or let's make it 160. Or 132. So, or if you want to take kind of like existing tempo and just speed it up, but kind of keep the curve. Or I wanted to ramp up in tempo. So just gradually speed up and slow down. So you can do stuff like that very easily. And so, but once you have kind of, once you've done the tempo detection, go to advanced to set definition from tempo. And then all the tracks will kind of have the individual tempo metadata per beat embedded. And then the files will know how to react to change along with the tempo changes that you want. So if the group sped up too much or was too boring, you wanted it to be a little more interesting tempo wise, you could do that quite easily once you determine the tempo. So we had a question like dealing with when recording acoustic drums and there's a tempo change coming up. Is there a way to have a cue maybe for the drummer to know that the tempo change is coming? So let's go ahead and take a look. What I've done in a couple scenarios, and this is one of the cool things in 9.5, is let's say if we have a signature track, we'll add a signature track and a tempo track. Okay, so let's say we're at 4/4, and I turn on my click track. So one of the things that you could do is, we have within 9 like the click pattern editor. So let's say we're at 120 beats a minute. And then you could actually double click and see the click pattern editor. So what people indicating that maybe there's a tempo change coming at measure 9 is you could actually just go to your draw tool here and say at the 8th measure, you want to go and have a double tempo pattern. So, and let's say at measure 9, you wanted to put in a 4/4, but let's say now it's going to also be a change. So let's say it's going to go down in tempo. So this way, as they're playing along, we hear the normal click, and then when they know that when they hear that double click, that there's a that there's the tempo changes coming up right after that. So again, you could just double click here and you could have different patterns. So a standard click pattern. Sorry, I'll just change that to 4/4. And then the bar before, a tempo change. So just as a way of cueing. So you could just double click and go directly to your click pattern editor. And then, there's all sorts of, great functionality that you could do into your metronome setup with different click patterns or click sounds. So, all sorts of great stuff. But that would be a way to give a cue to a musician that perhaps it's going to slow down right after you hear the double speed click. All right, so I have a question. Discuss something about 64-bit. There's a lot of confusion between 32 and 64-bit because they're kind of used. There's two different aspects that are used interchangeably. One is 64-bit and 32-bit in regards to memory addressing. So a lot of earlier plugins and programs are 32-bit, meaning that they could address up to 4 gigabytes of RAM. Depending upon your operating system, some could do 2 gigabytes of RAM, some could do 4 gigabytes. And way back when, I was like unfathomable that you could have 4 gigabytes of RAM. But then as composers started coming up with, trying to replicate an entire orchestra in a computer, 4 gigabytes of RAM was just a severe limitation. So we developed 64-bit processing. So we did that so that you could have, I think, I know a lot of composer friends now have 128 gigs of RAM and don't do anything below that. So it allows them to have significantly more memory, and there's better memory addressing and increased system stability. So with that, some 32-bit plugins would need to be bridged. In previous versions, we did that until version 9, and then after 10 years, we decided just to go forward with 64-bit. Now, there's also 32-bit floating point and 64-bit floating point processing. And these often get confused with memory addressing because you hear 32-bit, 64-bit, and people often use them erroneously interchangeably. What 32-bit floating point precision allows you to do is to have, for instance, a 24-bit recorded file to be processed through a number of different effects and EQs and inserts, and to allow that precision to be a 32-bit floating point. So Steinberg was one of the first companies that did 32-bit floating point, and that resulted in the capability of being able to incorporate all of your external mixing engines, all of your effects, EQs, software instruments at a much higher fidelity, so that you're not kind of truncating the original 24-bit file. Now, this is also, as computers have gotten faster, recently with Cubase 9.5, it introduced a double precision 64-bit floating point. And it can be sonically, apparent on particular tracks if you're doing maybe like a hardcore punk track with not a lot of subtleties. It may not come across, but a lot of mastering engineers are very happy with the change going to a double precision engine. So you have 32-bit, 64-bit memory addressing and 32 and 64-bit resolutions in terms of the audio engine. So Cubase can do, runs on 64-bit processing for plugins and memory. We've been doing it for 11 years, maybe 12 at this point. And we do 32-bit floating point and 64-bit floating point for the mix engine. So I hope that makes it a little clearer. All right, so we had a question on extracting like the MIDI groove quantized. So let's see, I think I may have a project that. All right, so how do you use like maybe a MIDI drum? So let's say we have a MIDI pattern here, like a drum loop, as well as and I want to see it I have a drum loop in audio and a drum loop in MIDI. And let's say that they're not quite lining up. So if we listen to it, so we'll just listen to our drum loop. So let's listen to just the drums. Okay, so what we can do is come here and we can see that we can quantize via a lot of different components. But if we come directly to, and if we listen to these two different grooves together, they're not quite tight. So if I wanted to double click on this part on my drum loop, we could go to hit points and we could kind of determine our threshold here. And then if we wanted to, I could say create groove. And as soon as I create groove, it's going to automatically show up directly here as I quantize. So now if I select my MIDI and then hit the letter Q, all of my MIDI stuff will now line up directly. So again, if I wanted to undo that, we can see that when I apply the groove, so just selecting it, and this is my groove preset from that drum loop that we created, hit the letter Q, you'll see those notes shift. Now let's say if I wanted to do the opposite, really all I'd have to do, you could open up kind of your groove quantize, and you could just drag the part over like that. Come here, let's create slices on our audio events. We could select the slice, and now we could shift the individual slices here. We'll just make it a little bigger so it's easier to see. And now we have the audio following the MIDI groove. So those are two easy ways to kind of quantize MIDI from audio, audio to MIDI, MIDI to MIDI, audio to audio, etc. So a question going back to the audio connection. So the number that we see, that is limited to the inputs and outputs of my audio interface I'm using, which is the UR44. So the question, is it possible to scroll tracks from the left side? So let's say if I have a large project, let me just jump to one here. So if I just kind of hover over my tracks and use my mouse scroll wheel, we can just scroll that way. So maybe, I'm not sure if I'm misunderstanding, but that's an easy way to kind of scroll the tracks on the left side. I'm not sure if you mean in the visibility settings, but you could as you select your different tracks here, you can scroll up and down and be able to select accordingly. So if you want to go to different effects channels, so you could scroll up and down and select and then navigate. So question, when Cubase has lots of tracks, does it set a precedent of MIDI over audio? I believe they're all have the same priority, so I don't think there's any precedent. I know like in early days of sequencers, like going back to the Atari, the very first track would be, when dealing with external MIDI, often the very first track gets, slightly, ever so slightly, that'll get the priority for playback if you have like, zillion MIDI notes going on, beat one. So, that could have effect, but, in the world of virtual instruments, it's not really, doesn't really have that much of an impact. Just reading through a couple quick questions here. Sorry. All right, sorry, just kind of jumped way ahead. Just getting back to different questions here. All right, so we had a question on like a tape stop effect, how we could do that. So we had a couple questions on it. So let me just jump here. So, you could actually kind of do it. There's a tape machine mode that you could do as well. But one of the plugins that you get with Cubase is called Loop Mash FX. So if I wanted to just kind of take this, let me just turn off my bad EQing here. So, and this falls under other. So if you wanted to come here, you could actually play this from MIDI. So if you want to do like kind of So there's different like tape stop effects here, and you can set kind of the pulse so it might be slower. So you could actually, once that is set up, you could then play it in MIDI or just automate the plugin. So that's a really easy way of doing different tape stop effects. So we had a question about locking the video so it doesn't move left or right. Let me just see if we could do that real quick. I may have to change my frame rate again. Doesn't like that codec for that one. Let me just... Okay, so let's say we have our video here. So I think if we, let's see if we can lock the video there. Let me just see if we take that video track. And so once you select the video track, looks like you can lock the video there. Let me just make sure it makes sense with your question. Yeah, so I think if you just simply select the video track and then click on lock, that tempo changes won't affect it. So a question, does, can MediaBay scan third-party VSTs and look for presets? It can. It just has to be the third-party plugin. I think it has to be VST3 and set up for it. But MediaBay is capable of it. A lot of companies still are like stuck on VST2 versions. So often that's more the culprit than MediaBay not being able to do the scanning. So we had a question if we could activate a key change to a specific portion of a project. So one of the things that you could do is have a transpose track that a lot of people aren't hip to. So let's say we're playing along here. So I'll just take this into linear mode here really quickly. So let's say while I'm playing, I could just put in this part and say, let's go up 3. So while we're playing, and then go back down to could do. So that way you could actually just kind of click here and, you know, tell it how to transpose. It doesn't necessarily take it from major to minor or to, you know, diminished scales, but you can go up or down pretty easily using the transpose track. Excuse me. So someone was mentioning about maybe their metronome is too low. So, you know, if you have your metronome set up here and you have a signature track, one of the cool things you could do is to just say render audio click between locators. And then once you do that, it's in straight audio file, and then you could add more gain. So if you wanted to, so if you wanted to be, you know, softer, louder, you know, at that point you could just simply have it as a normal audio file that you could add a ton more gain. Sometimes the drummers setting up like, you know, different sounds for the click track can also make a difference. So a question, does Cubase sound better than Logic or Pro Tools? You know, when we've done a lot of like listening tests at different stores and facilities, you know, people tend to like the way Cubase sounds better. I'm not sure if it's anything that we're doing well or we just work hard not to screw up the audio engine and affect the integrity of the audio. So I'm seeing a question. I would like to know how to program my MIDI controller with Cubase to jump from track 1 to 5 in a live situation using VST instruments. So a lot of times the MIDI controllers, you know, some of them will have some form of Mackie control. You could do that, but a lot of times I know people, you know, will set up, you know, they're, you know, will set up like all their different synths layers into basically into folders. Um, so, you know, sometimes, you know, jumping down 7, you know, may not, you know, it could make sense to kind of have it laid out for in order. But a lot of people I know will take these tracks and move selected tracks to a new folder. And that folder could be all the different files, all the different sounds that they need. And they could just activate that folder to get different synth layers. So a lot of people do that. And then you could just jump down to the next folder as needed. So there's a lot of comments on Cubase 10. So I'm sure there's a lot of guys in Germany that are working on it. But we can't really just, you know, I don't know new features in detail yet. But there's a lot of guys that are always working to make sure you have the greatest version of Cubase available to you. So people want more than 64 instrument slots. So let me just take a quick look. Just try a new project here. But I think there's unlimited MIDI tracks. So, I know people are running, 3,200 MIDI tracks. So someone said there's a limitation of 64. So I just can add, here I just added 142 instrument channels. So I don't think it's a limit of Cubase for instrument tracks. So again, within Hallion, you could have one instrument slot that has 64 instruments within one instrument slot. So perhaps there's a bit of difference in terminology, but I don't think you're limited to 64 instruments. So a question on is there a drum, like a tool to measure phase between tracks? What I know a lot of people do in that situation is just simply kind of eyeball it, so they'll take a number of different tracks here, and then just zoom in. And then, at this point, one of the cool things to do is, Michael Wagner taught me this, and he's done some amazing drum stuff, where he often will just take, the tracks here and ever so slightly nudge them. And sometimes he puts it ahead so it hits the compressor differently. But also directly here, you could have the track delay in milliseconds as well. So to be able to kind of pre-delay tracks as well is really handy. So you could do that and kind of eyeball it. And some people also mentioned using like a multi-scope plugin. So if you come here, I think that's probably under tools. So okay, so question: when importing files, MIDI or audio, is the tempo set by Cubase on importation, or do the imported files overrule? Generally, a MIDI file can contain the audio tempo information, or a MIDI file can contain a tempo track itself, which often has a tempo. And then at that point, but the audio files, if they're tempo stamped in MIDI information, can automatically, if it's in musical mode, adapt to the current Cubase tempo, but it may not necessarily change the tempo in Cubase to reflect the imported media. Okay, so there's a question if kind of using a stomp box of some sort to control transport. There's a number of different ones. If you come here, if you go to your studio setup, you could set up a generic MIDI remote to, do a number of different functions for, I know people use different foot controllers to control transports and live performance, use like guitar pedals that go on and off. I think so there's some interesting ones that are just being released now as well. So yeah, but you could set that up by going into your studio setup, clicking on the plus sign, and then going to generic remote. And then you could set that up for controlling different transport functionalities quite easily. So a question about adding a USB microphone. So often you just want to make sure you go to your studio setup and then go to the VST audio system and select your USB mic right there. So nothing really special, just selecting it as the driver source. You want to get a USB mic that has a headphone out. Some of the early USB mics were just a microphone, had no monitoring system, so there's nothing to really offset timing issues. So Cubase didn't like that appropriately. So make sure that if you get a USB mic, that you actually have it set up for, one that has like a headphone monitoring path. Okay, so someone mentioned that maybe when they're following me on the DAW and they're listening to it that they can't hear it. So make sure when you go to your studio setup and it could depend on your audio interface, but you go to the VST audio system, you have a release ASIO driver when application in background. Some audio interfaces do that well, some don't. So it could really depend on the interface driver. So question, sometimes working with a friend who has Logic, and when I send tracks, he adjusts an offset for them to line up. So is there anything you can do differently in Cubase? I'm not sure why it would be different. If it's a timing thing, it could be that perhaps, most of everything's based at kind of sample level, it's sample resolution. It could be like perhaps a SMPTE frame rate is set differently between the two, but it should kind of line up. I don't think there's anything special you have to do in Cubase. Okay, someone has a Triton rack in Cubase. Can they just pull up all the patches? So let's come over here. So let's go to your MIDI device manager. You could install device. So let's say you had something, I'm not sure if there's a Triton rack in here. So let's say Triton by Chord, define where it's connected into your audio interface. And then you could say open device. And now when we go to add a MIDI track, we could choose the Triton, and then you could see your various, depending on, that's probably just for, but that's how you could do it. So go to your MIDI device manager and install device, and you could download these from, you know, any number of sources. So let's say I have a D50. So define what connection it is. You go to add a MIDI track. So say we add a MIDI track. Set the sound here to your D50. And we'll just say it's connected to, and then you can see all your different patch names. Okay, we had a question for any plugins or any plan for plugin to wireless in-ear monitoring. So using kind of the control room, as long as the audio is set up for your in-ear monitors, you should be all, you know, and it's being sent to an in-ear unit. You know, it's just literally taking audio, so it's not really configured differently in Cubase versus other, it's not really configured differently in Cubase, whether it's wired or wireless. So you just kind of, within the VST connections window, what you want to do is to, or the audio connections, like years of habit, just make sure that you have the Q mix set up. So you want to add a Q mix, and at that point, just define its connection wherever that's being spit out to your wireless in-ears, wired in-ears, headphones. It'll work all the same. We also had a question on chord pads. If we could take, humanize chord pads to do different types of, different types of like emulating guitar strumming. So if you have a MIDI part with, what you could do, let's say if you have kind of a MIDI part that's actually set up. So let's say if I added a quick MIDI track. And let's say I had this set up as, like, let's say that's my favorite guitar strum for some reason. But once you have the chord pads, one of the things you could do is if you go to kind of your setup here, and you could go to players, and then you could choose to have different patterns. So you could actually just drag and drop a MIDI part and then use that as the basis for the chord pad itself. So that way you could just simply use that like great kind of guitar MIDI parts inside of Cubase, and that would allow you to also be able to kind of tweak, and instead of just playing a straight block chord, you could have it play different arpeggiators for you. We had a question about using RX6 with Cubase, and this is probably for offline processing. So some different processes you may want to just turn off auto apply and kind of do the tweaks, and then click on, initially start it off with auto apply turned off. So I would try that. Some particular processes work better that way. Okay, so we had a question like how to do stems from one project and import it into another. It's really, all you had to do is come directly here. If you do an export audio mixdown, we have the batch export functionality. And here you can say, I'm going to take all my output channels, the group channels, the effects channels, the audio channels, virtual instruments. All these can be set up so that when you export, it can make equal length stem files very easily. All right, so we're just at about 4 o'clock. I'm gonna have to go pick up my son from school. But if you have just a really quick last minute question before we wrap up, I want to thank everyone for great questions we had today. I hope everyone has learned a couple tips or tricks. If you have one, really hot, quick question, please feel free to enter it in the comments field, and we'll wait just a second. All right, we had a question about entering in different tempo change from 100 to or 90 to 120, and this could be done just in the tempo track. So go to tempo track, right click. We could see kind of your tempo information here. You want to make sure that the tempo track is turned on. So at that point, you can now So now you could just kind of draw in, and you could enter in different values right here. Okay, so what was the question about the Halion Sonic SE3 from Rude? Okay, question, how do we in advance? You could send them to clubcubase at steinberg.net. Also, if you like the Hangout, make sure that you click on the like button and that you subscribe to the channel. Okay, so let's take a look real quick at the Halion Sonic SE. Sorry if I missed that. If you wanted to, let's just take a quick look at it. So I think I remember the question kind of being with the chord pads here. If you could just refresh my memory really quick. Just about that, about the chord pads. And All right. If you want to email me, I could answer that question about the chord pads here. If you want to just send me a quick email to clubcubase at steinberg.net. All right. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and wrap up. I want to thank everyone for the great questions. And again, if someone wants to actually do the index for all the topics covered, that's super helpful for everyone. And if you have questions for the future, please send it to clubcubase at steinberg.net. And feel free to like this video and to subscribe to the channel so you'll be notified of future Hangouts. Thank you so much. I hope everyone's learned a couple things. All right. Well, thank you so much, and we'll see you next time in a couple weeks. Goodbye.